back to The Bulwark Goes to Hollywood. My name is Sonny Bunch. I'm culture editor at The Bulwark. And I'm very pleased to be rejoined today by Chris Yogerst. He is the author of, amongst other books, Hollywood Hates Hitler, Jew-Baiting Anti-Nazism, and the Senate Investigation into Warmongering in Motion Pictures. He was on the show to talk about that. And also the new book, The Warner Brothers, from Kentucky Press. Chris is an associate professor of communication in the Department of Arts and Humanities at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. Love having him on the show. Chris, thanks for being back.
Thanks for having me back. I appreciate it.
So we are going to talk today about the Warner Brothers, who were, of course, it's not just the name of the studio. The Warner Brothers, an actual group of brothers in early Hollywood, some of the first moguls, and they have an interesting family history here. But what was it about the Warner Brothers and, you know, the hole in the literature about them that made you want to write this book?
Well, the whole project started as I wanted to write a biography of Harry Warner, because when you think of like the Warner Brothers, it's always like Jack Warner is the Warner brother, right? He lived the longest, and he was still alive when old Hollywood fever started and everyone was getting interviewed that was still around in the 70s. And I was going to write a book about Harry Warner, and then I met biographer Pat McGilligan at a book talk, and he wanted to have lunch, and he said, yeah, you need to do all of the brothers. And I was like, wow, that sounds like a really hard project. I mean, that's way bigger than just Harry Warner. And he's like, well, but everyone knows the Warner Brothers. Nobody necessarily, there's not a lot of people who just would know Harry Warner right off the bat. So I'm like, well, that's a good point. So he's like, if you want people to really notice it and actually have this fill a gap in the literature, you should tackle the brothers, because there's, it's been a long time. There's been little books like David Thompson had his small book a few years ago and stuff like that, which is it's basically just kind of rehashing. It's good, but it's rehashing a lot of stuff we already know. So I had an opportunity to bring this to Kentucky Press, the Screen Classics series that Pat edits, and really try to focus on all of the brothers, which I even found, more about Jack than I expected. So, but as a part of this process, I was able to kind of recenter Harry as the central and really important figure that he is. And one of the things that drew me to him was that he's so different than all these other moguls. He seems to kind of subvert all of these like nasty, not all of them, but a lot of the nasty narratives we have about the old studio bosses and stuff like that. He seemingly was very much a cut above the rest. So I had an opportunity to fit him into a story, and I'm very happy that I was able to do that.
Yeah, I mean, of the brothers, the three who I think form the meat of this book. You have Jack, obviously, who is, as you say, kind of the old school Louis B. Mayer type, right? He's kind of a womanizer, and kind of a tyrant on the studio lots. You have Harry, who is I think a fair way to describe him in this book and in your research is as the conscience of the studio. The kind of political, ideological, but also business conscience of the studio. And then you have Sam, who I think is really interesting, and especially in an era when we're thinking a lot about technological change and how that works within Hollywood itself. He was the guy who really pushed for sound and wanted the technological innovations that led to the talkies and all that. When you were researching them, what was your takeaway on how they interacted with each other and how they both aided and kind of retarded each other's efforts to build the studio up?
That's what I found is a lot of what, I mean, even going back to a great book like Neil Gabler's An Empire of Their Own, a lot of what he outlined in there still holds true. What I really found, as far as like Sam being the technical genius, right, and Jack being kind of the goofball, and Harry, like you said, is the kind of the conscience of the studio, and that's one of the reasons I wanted to focus on him, is because all of the reasons we love Warner Brothers, these social conscience movies. That whole mindset came from Harry. And then we had Albert, who man, was he hard to find stuff about. He avoided the press big time. But he did a lot of interviews in the early days. I was able to, I mean, so he was, a lot like Harry, very business minded, very smart with distribution and stuff like that. Um, and one of the things I found that, I suppose that hindered, well, really that helped. I mean, they made a lot more mistakes. I mean, one of the things that was surprised, I mean, I know they had started in the early 1900s with a single theater and then growing from there. But one of the things that I guess surprised me is how many like startups and failures they had between 1905 and 1923. So it's like you think of, they're doing the 100th of Warner Brothers this year. It's the centennial, and it's easy to assume it's like, oh well, they probably got their start around then. It's like, no, man, by 1923 they were old pros. Like they had fought Thomas Edison. They had been put out of business. They they had theaters. They had distribution networks. They had lost those, started again, and they were really seasoned vets. And I think that's why they had so much success in the 1920s and grew so fast, because they had already learned a lot, a lot from their mistakes.
Well, what did they learn? I mean, what was it about those early Warner Brothers movies that were like, oh, this is we don't really think. I think today audiences don't necessarily look at studio labels and think this is a Warner Brothers movie, this is a Universal movie, this is a Paramount movie. We think this is a Star, or this is a comic book I recognize, right? It's different. But once upon a time, you said this is a Warner Brothers movie, and people understood what that meant.
Absolutely, absolutely. So they, in those early days, those pre 1923 days, I mean, yes, they were running theaters, they had distribution networks, they started to dabble in production and make movies and try that out. They were the first studio, from what I can tell, to roadshow a movie when I think it was Sam who found a copy of Dante's Inferno, and they were roadshowing it with somebody reading some from the book along with the movie. And by the late teens, they were doing a lot of movies or they seem to be mostly interested in movies that either big adventure. They did a serial called The Lost World, I believe. They were kind of close to the Sea League Zoo, so they were their buddies there, and they were able to use some of the animals. But they made a lot of social conscious movies. So they made, I'm forgetting the title of it, but I know Sam was involved in this government assisted movie about venereal disease. So there's these little things like that. But then, of course, one of the ones that shows up in some books is My 4 Years in Germany, which, by the ambassador. So they were already, we're at the tail end of World War I, and, they're already thinking of, making a movie that's really touching on the kinds of things that are in newspapers. And, they were already looking at optioning bestsellers. Harry was really interested in that, and Sam was very interested in that. So they were already, by the time they incorporated, they already were interested in making movies that were about things that were in the headlines, as well as finding popular books that already had an audience that they could make into movies. So those were two things that clearly drove them, and were driving them by 1923.
Yeah. One thing that's interesting in your book is, repeatedly we hear Harry Warner in particular talking about the ability of movies to change society, to impact society, to alter how people think, and that is also what some of the moral crusaders at the time argued, right? Like, so Will Hayes, for instance, there's a quote in here. I think it was when the Jazz Singer came out, but maybe it was a little before or after. But anyway, this is Hayes says, quote, immeasurable influence as a living, breathing thing on the ideas and ideals, the customs and costumes, the hopes and ambitions of countless men and women and children, end quote. That's what he believed film could be, right? And that leads to a lot of conflict between Hayes and then later Joseph Breen and the Warners, because, Hayes and Breen say, well, you're making these gangster movies. That's going to make kids want to be gangsters. It's bad for society. And the Warners say, no, we're showing that this is bad. Like it's one of the early depiction versus endorsement battles, which I find really interesting that we're still kind of having them.
Absolutely, yeah, and Harry weighed in on this early too. I mean, as soon as there was pushback on gangster movies, he very publicly commented multiple times. I know at least one of them I quote in the book in the 30s, where he essentially says that these kids aren't criminals because of movies. Like they were probably already up to no good. And then, so this whole, and the juvenile delinquency comes up again in the 50s, and Jack goes to defend the studio. But the Warners were really clever about doing this. I mean, and my favorite example is, right, they're making these big gangster movies, and then the code comes in, Joseph Breen comes in, or the code finally gets enforced by 34. Breen is there, and then Hayes says, as soon as John Dillinger is killed, nobody's making a movie about John Dillinger, right? Like we can't do this stuff anymore. So Warner Brothers makes G-Men. So they take Cagney, who's been this gangster, and they make him the good guy, acting basically like the gangster still, just he's a bureau man now. And they rip so much from the headlines in that movie. I mean, the whole Little Bohemia shootout, in all the Dillinger stuff is essentially in G-Men, just in another context. So they're still creatively ripping from the headlines and just saying, well, we're on the side of good now. They, and they were really good about finding stories that still touched on the moment, where there was the proper amount of comeuppance. I mean, a movie like Black Legion with Humphrey Bogart deals with, the rise of racism and anti-Semitism and things like that. And very cleverly, they were able to depict really all this bad movement with this character that gets swept up in it that pays the price in the end. So they were able to weather that really effectively and still make really edgy, punchy movies, even when the code was, as written and as enforced, was seemingly supposed to be watering these movies down.
Yeah. And of course, Warner Brothers was one of the first studios to really go to war with the Nazis, so to speak. They pull their people out of Germany in the early 1930s. Interesting. So one of the stories that is often told about the Warners, and that the Warners themselves would say, is that one of their employees was killed during a Nazi riot. But you found that that's not necessarily true. Is that?
No, that's not. That where that legend comes from is Jack Warner's memoir. He lays it out that this guy was killed and they pulled out of Germany, and the guy was not killed, but they did have an employee in Europe that was assaulted by the brown shirts, and so there was foul play that led them to pull out in 33, which was, they were the very first studio to pull out of Germany and say, we don't need your profits because we don't agree with you. So they were very much ahead of the curve there, because a lot of Hollywood got criticized for sticking around in Germany, for mostly just because there was the Great Depression, and it was a market where they were still making money. So they were in a tough spot there in terms of making some kind of moral decision about their business practices. But no, I think it was Phil Kaufman was assaulted, and it was covered in the press. So I found some of that, I think, in Variety. And yeah, so he was not killed. That was Jack, as the storyteller that he was, he made that a little bit more. He made a better story out of it than it was. But the baseline is, something did happen to one of their employees in Germany that really was kind of like the last straw for them to bounce.
Yeah. And then, of course, they start making actual, anti-Nazi films. Again, one of the first studios to really do that. Talk about that a little bit. How did that come about? How did their upbringing influence their thinking here?
Right. And that was another tricky situation for the studios. I mean, with the Warners and a lot of other studio moguls, I mean, they grew up in a part of Europe where, I mean, I know the Warners, their dad, Ben Warner, was going to his, going to his services in secret, because it was they would get attacked if they knew, Jews were going to pray or worship. And and do their thing, over here. So they had to. It was all secret. And Harry Warner, as one of the oldest, that really had an impact on him. Coming of age and learning about his family's faith, and that it was um, so scrutinized and dangerous to do where he was. That when they saw this rising again in Europe. It really struck a chord. And of course, the problem was not only, of course, they pulled out of Germany, their product out of Germany, but the production code, one of the rules was that you could not ridicule other countries or religions. And this was tricky because if you went after Nazi Germany, as justified as it was, it actually went against the production code rules. So that's why when Warner Brothers first started, these movies were all allegorical, and they wouldn't say Jew, or they wouldn't say Nazi Germany. It was all, things were just implied, like in Black Legion we were talking about. I think Humphrey Bogart makes a comment about somebody getting a raise because of the size of their nose. So now they're playing on these stereotypes that everybody knows, and just going right up to where you're directly saying it and just not saying it. They did the same thing with They Won't Forget, which was based loosely on the Leo Frank case from the teens, which was a whole thing about anti-Semitism that a lot of people who would have been living at the time would have known. But by 1939, when Confessions of a Nazi Spy comes out, they finally decided, we're just going to go all in, and we're gonna use the words, we're gonna call it like we see it, and see what happens. And that's totally on brand for Warner Brothers, because they've been beating to their own drum all along, and that really opened the floodgates. And lots of other, not a lot of other movies. I mean, like you said, I wrote the book about the Senate investigation that went after all this stuff. I mean, there was enough anti-Nazi movies. There wasn't a ton of them, but they did have an impact. And you definitely saw, by 39, 40, early 41, enough of these movies coming out by major studios with big stars. Where studios were finally comfortable putting themselves out there and where they stood on what was going on in Europe before we were involved in the war.
Yeah, and you write a little bit about this, about FDR's involvement here. What was the involvement between Hollywood and the White House? Specifically the Warner Brothers. I know we're close with FDR. What was the relationship like there? I mean, obviously, we'll talk about this a little bit more on A Mission to Moscow, which I think is a very interesting little diversion. But what was the White House saying to Warner Brothers and the rest about how to help with the war effort?
Oh, right. The Warners were known as basically like the FDR studio, and there was, and it's referenced in their movies where they're clearly, characters are supporting the National Recovery Act and all this kind of stuff. So they really put themselves out there as, a lot of Hollywood was supportive of FDR, but I mean, they put themselves out there in their movies as a pro FDR studio. Harry Warner was giving speeches, talking about Warner. I know they were in contact with the president's office. That's one thing that really the Warner Brothers, I think that was one of their strengths, and really it speaks to their interest in topical stories, is that they were always in contact with the White House, and Harry was always sending letters, getting meetings and stuff like that. And with Roosevelt, they were really in lockstep with everything he was doing for a lot of the 30s, up and through. They got real vocal when the Lend-Lease bill went through in early 41, which is not unlike what we had been doing, with the Russian invasion and all this kind of stuff. We're essentially just sending material, sending, ammunition and all that kind of everything except soldiers. It was a way for us to, still say we weren't involved in the war. But Warner Brothers, one of the things Harry Warner was doing is he was trying to, I guess this deviates from FDR a little bit, but he was holding meetings at his house where he was getting other studio moguls involved with discussions of like, how can we help the country be better? How can we not only use movies, but use our own platforms to build bridges between politics between religions and all this kind of stuff. And that really speaks to a lot of who Harry Warner was. And I think that a lot of that trickles down through the kind of movies that get made as well.
Yeah. As I mentioned, so there's a movie that's made around this time, Mission to Moscow, which is ends up being pretty controversial for Warner Brothers because it's based on a work by a very USSR sympathizing government official, which then in turn they wind up whitewashing a lot of the Stalin's crimes, etc. But the argument that the Warners make when they're hauled in front of the Senate I can't even remember if it was the Senate or the House is they were our allies at the time. We were just trying to help out.
Yeah, there was this came up in the infamous HUAC investigations, and they hammered Jack Warner with this, and I really kind of felt bad for Jack because he was right when this movie was made. The multiple studios made movies sympathetic with Russia in 43, early 44 because they were our allies for a time, and it's these all movies. I mean, I know in another book, Tom Doherty made a good point where it's like all of these movies seemed like a good idea at the time and then very quickly became not so great. And right, yeah, they picked up. I mean, and just like the movie in 1918 that they did with the ambassador, to Germany, they made a similar move. They found Ambassador Davies, who was in Russia in the late 30s. And he really whitewashed the purge trials, and a lot of made it look like anybody who was sentenced to death or murdered or put in jail or whatever these were all bad actors, which turns out wasn't the case. And it's funny, when I was writing this book, I had a fellowship at UW-Madison, and one of the other fellows was a historian there her focus is on Russia. And we had some interesting conversations about this movie and about that ambassador, and she definitely had some opinions on this ambassador. And one of the things that comes up with the Warner history is were they or weren't they in communication with the Kremlin? Were they in communication with Stalin? All this kind of stuff. And it turns out that even though they were denying this, Robert Buckner, who was the producer here, was going back and forth to Russia. And so they were certainly in communication with, if not Stalin directly. I mean, I found a letter in the Warner Brothers archives that it's unsigned, but I'm pretty sure it's a letter to Stalin. It's a letter to Stalin. I know that. It's probably from Jack, because he was probably the only one with the least political clout to think this might not be a good idea. But the movie was screened Stalin watched it. Buckner was there, and all his reports said that everybody was laughing at the movie, like they thought it was the stupidest thing ever. But it was pure propaganda. I mean, there's no question about it there. Just like the book, the movie whitewashes, all of it makes Russia look good. And it's just one of those weird things. Like, yep, we were, like Jack said, in 47, I mean, which only 3 years later, we were allies. And this was it was a wartime production. And it's really not a whole lot different than the early war movies where, the good guys always win. There's not a lot of bloodshed. Thinking early, like Desperate Journey, these kinds of things. These movies with Errol Flynn, and they're really simplistic. And yeah, it's just wartime propaganda.
Yeah. Let's shift gears slightly here. So there's some interesting stuff in this book about the Warner Brothers and their fights with the unions, which is obviously kind of relevant to the moment. It's funny to look at the picketing today and compare it to the riots. I think is a fair way to describe what happened in 45 and 46. I mean, so tell us a little bit about that, and also I want you to discuss a little bit about IATSE and the mob, because this was something I did not know about. There's a actual you know, mobster essentially running IATSE and shaking down the Warners. This is all very fascinating to me. So why don't we start there and then move to
Okay.
the labor action?
Sure. Yeah, this goes back to the 30s. So there was a gangster named Willie Byoff, which is a perfect name. And he was shaking down the studios as early as the 30s. So he was trying to take over IATSE, and what he was doing as early as the 30s is he was essentially mobbing up that union, and then anyone else who tried to do a rival union would either get intimidated, shaken down, and in some cases killed. And there's some legends out there that he was, in some of the early days, he was killing some of these people himself. There was some really wild stories in Chicago that I found about a rival union boss getting murdered, and in pretty spectacular fashion, so it would get headlines. So he was doing this. That established the fear of this guy. So then what he started to do, once he had his fingers in the union, he started going to the studios and saying, well, I could issue a strike, but if you give me 50 grand, there'll be no strike. So stuff like that. So he was shaking down. I know Harry Cohn for sure. I know the Warner Brothers, of course. The Warner Brothers ended up having to testify about this once the government started cracking down on organized crime and his activities, at least the union part of it. And they kind of hammered Albert and Harry about, like, why didn't you come to us? And they both said this. Basically, we thought we would get murdered, so we were scared. And letters would come to the house. I know Harry's daughter had told some stories over the years of some of the intimidation and fear tactics that way about, we're going to kill you. Here's where we're going to hide your bodies and all this kind of stuff. So it was scary. And by the time there was a lot of the whole union situation is very complicated in Hollywood in the 30s and early 40s. And you had not only mob leaders with some of this, but then you have these kind of agitators that it might not necessarily be mobsters, but they were more like Herbert Sorrell, who wasn't really a gangster. He was just more of like a pain in the ass. And he wanted strikes. He wanted riots. He was pushing this as far as he could. The reason the riots happened on Warner Brothers, like you said, and that's there. I know there's one headline. I don't know if it was LA Examiner or LA of Times. They called it the Battle of Burbank. It got ugly. So you had this labor leader in Sorrell who was there every morning telling people to really take the gloves off, get angry. The Warner Brothers head of security was a guy named Blaney Matthews. And Blaney Matthews was a former investigator for the Los Angeles DA. He was a guy really well-versed in his own intimidation and getting info and all this kind of stuff. So he was ready for war the second there was going to be a possible strike at Warner Brothers and people showed up in a picket line. He lined people up and was basically said, go at them. And a battle ensued, and like there's pictures. You can just Google image search, Warner Brothers riots, and you'll find tipped over cars and fire hoses, and people were hurt, and lots of people were hurt. There was weapons and stories of blackjacks and wrenches and all kinds of stuff, and this was happening. It was probably worse at Warner Brothers, but in the early 40s there was riots at or at least really aggressive strikes at Disney, at Universal. This was popping up all over the place. It just got, the worst was at Warner Brothers, I think, just because you kind of had the tension from the Warners of these shakedowns over the years, and then combine it with a labor leader who is really pissed off. And it just, everything boiled and it got ugly fast.
Yeah, it's wild to read about. Again, just in comparison to what is going on today, just which is fairly tame, right, by comparison. But then there was also there were tensions between the unions, right? I mean, there's some the SAG, which is at the time headed by Ronald Reagan, is a little less radical than the other union, which the abbreviation is escaping me, but is headed by Sterling Hayden, I think. What was going on there? That was have I mistaken? Have I gotten this mixed up in my head? I'm
No, yeah, it's there. There's a lot of layers to this. I'm actually paging back through my book too to remember some of this because it's because there was there was IATSE, which we've talked about, right?
Right.
There was also the Conference of Studio Unions.
Yes, the CSU.
And this is the one that this was one of them that was so. The interesting thing about the unions at this time, there was either accusations of being mobbed up or accusations of being communist. And the Conference of Studio Unions was one of these that had accusations of, and this also probably came from Blaney Matthews, who was one of the Warner Brothers people who was throwing around the communist slur everywhere he could. And there was this rumor that after the battle at Burbank, there's Communist Party leaflets were found and all this kind of stuff. And so I think this all started to solidify what would happen in 47 in terms of HUAC and questions of communism. But I also Jack Warner, so at the time, like you said, Ronald Reagan was the head of SAG, and Jack Warner was very appreciative. And at this point, it's you have to remember at this point, Ronald Reagan was he identified as a liberal. I mean, with a lot of what he said and did, he was pretty centrist, pretty middle of the road, and he really tried to weather the politics and the industry as best he could with saving the union, keeping any kind of radicalism out of it, whether it was actual communists, whether it was the mob, all this kind of stuff. And that's what. And that's something I think informed Jack Warner a lot too, in terms of, he really respected Ronald Reagan after all the strike. I mean, I guess the thing that we should point out is that the Battle of Burbank, those unions, that wasn't SAG, that wasn't above the line labor, that was all artisans, right? That was carpenters, that was set designers, it was all trade type jobs on the lot. So the actors and directors and producers weren't involved in this kind of stuff. And a lot of them were kind of taken aback and surprised by a lot of it. So yeah, there was, and it really since the 30s, once you get into the 40s, thing to remember, a lot of these unions are not that old. So they're still, they had kind of they had to elbow themselves into the industry to get established. And then by the 40s, they were all wrapped up in political accusations or scandals or whatever, and now they had to fight that as well. But yeah, you're right. Sterling Hayden, I'm forgetting as well too. Hayden was really involved, and I can give a recommendation here too. The Tom Doherty's Show Trial is a book that it offers a really good cross section of where all the unions were coming from leading up to 47. So he does a good job kind of parsing all that out and where the politics were. It's off the top of my head. it's all jumbled up, but I know as far as informing the Warner Brothers, SAG, I think they had their eyes on, I think just because, one of their rising stars was the head of that. Mm-hmm. They had some, in terms of branding, they definitely had some interest in where that was headed.
Yeah, and I get the sense from reading your book that these battles with the unions kind of pushed the Warners, I think Jack and Harry both, a little further right than they had been. I mean, by the end of by the 1960s, right? You've got Jack Warner writing endorsement letters for Nixon over JFK. Right. Which is kind of wild. Can't imagine something like that, really happening today. But is interesting.
It is. I mean, they definitely, and even going back to the 20s. I mean, the biggest complaints about the Warners that seems to be justified from is from some of the actors. I mean, they definitely, I mean, to use a phrase usually attributed to Alfred Hitchcock. I mean, they treated actors like cattle. I mean, they just saw them as, punch in, punch out, you're overpaid kind of. There's lots of memos of Jack Warner and Harry Warner speaking that way of actors. But yeah, once the union stuff comes in and once HUAC comes in, they definitely take a step to the right. More so Jack. Well, and it's interesting. I mean, yeah, they're more so Jack. I think Harry was all most interested in trying to. I guess what's the best way to put it? By the time you get into the 50s, I mean, Harry's pretty old. He's looking at retirement. He's not as politically passionate. But like you said, Jack definitely takes a step to the right, supporting Nixon and all of that, which is, and of course, it's important to point out Nixon was on HUAC. Like, we hear all this about J. Parnell Thomas hammering his gavel and breaking his gavel, shouting at Dalton Trumbo, but Nixon was right there next to him. So the fact that any moguls would support Nixon following that is very telling of where their politics lie. But once you get into, but I think the big thing about them is they were smart about where the political winds were, and they wanted to be there. So of course, when the country's swept up in red fever, I feel like Jack, at least anyway, because he was not very politically savvy. I think he was more bandwagon as far as his politics go. He was like, all right, here's the red tide. We're gonna jump on board with that. But as soon as Kennedy, JFK becomes popular, he very quickly, starts sending letters, starts getting himself invited to dinners when Kennedy's going to be in town, and kind of trying to rub elbows with that. So he was also very quick to turn tail and go back towards the Democrats when that seemed to be the popular thing to do.
Yeah. No, it's interesting. Just how much of as with anything else in Hollywood, how much of it is driven by personalities and various resentments. It's
absolutely. Whereas, like, I think in the 30s, right, them being the big FDR studio, that was just, they were, they were even with the Depression. I mean, they weathered that fairly well. So they didn't have a whole lot to lose. FDR was pretty popular, right? 3-term president. I mean, so it was also kind of, even though there certainly FDR had his critics, but it wasn't real controversial to be pro FDR in the 30s.
Yeah.
So they seem to, a lot of it, I think, again, that probably comes from Harry's political savvy, where it was he was really good at knowing where the political winds were, where the power was going to be. And this is why he stood up in 41 to defend the studio against against the Senate that was going after anti-Nazi movies. He knew that was a minority opinion, and that they could trample that. And Jack, similarly, in the 50s, when the Senate went after Hollywood for seemingly encouraging or being encouraging teenage delinquency, Jack really impressively trampled all over Senator Kefauver there, who had just went after the mob, by the way, and then was going after Hollywood for Rebel Without a Cause and The Wild One and these movies. And there's some great back and forths there. But so it's Jack. As much as Jack was a bandwagon, I think as far as politics goes, he could step up when need be, and I think that, there's a lot, even with the HUAC stuff, when you listen to what he's doing, I mean, I think he was just terrified. I don't think he was this big ideologue. I think he was terrified that this was going to ruin Hollywood. And I think that's why he volunteered to jump on and go first. I mean, I think, Louis B. Mayer was also one of the first. I think it's a safer accusation, or a safer description, rather, to say, Louis B. Mayer was, very much an ideologue. But I think, Jack, I don't know. I think the best way to describe Jack is how he's always been described, as just kind of a clown.
Well, I mean, do you think do you, how to put this, uh, without trying to put my finger on the scale one way or the other. I mean, do you think he was actually worried about communist infiltration, particularly in the unions following the labor battles, or was it or not? I mean, or was he just worried about getting shut down by the government?
That's a really good question. I tend to, this is one of those things. Sometimes it depends on the day. I feel like right after, like if you think like right, 45, 46, 47, there was probably some real, and for a lot of people in the country, I think there was that, it's why we call that, the Red Scare is a perfect description of this. There was just a lot of fear mongering going on. A lot of people were afraid, justifiably or not. And it was, you look at, you listen to people who were growing up during that time, and, they say the polarization today can't even hold a candle to how bad it was in the late 40s and early 50s over a lot of this fear of communism. So I think there was probably a little justified fear in the beginning. I think once you get to HUAC and the Waldorf Statement and the blacklist and a lot of this kind of stuff, I think the biggest thing for a lot of the studio moguls was a fear that if they didn't take a stand, people would stop going to movies. And, a lot of this era has been portrayed as, well, they all became these huge anti-communists. It's like, well, the Hollywood moguls were pro-Hollywood above everything else. So, and there's even stories that have been coming out more and more of even like Louis B. Mayer, who was the most, reactionary of the moguls, who even during the blacklist era was known to say he didn't give a shit what a writer's politics were, as long as they were putting out good product. And it was similar from the Warners. Dalton Trumbo has some conflicting stories on that, but as we know, Dalton Trumbo is also a really good storyteller. It's what made him such a great writer. So I think it's a little bit of both. I mean, I think there's a period where there was a very real fear, and then I think that kind of gave way to just an overarching concern of just trying to save the business and trying to placate the public. And if they feel like the public feels that Hollywood is overrun with communists, which it really wasn't, then people are going to stop going to movies, and they're going to be out of business. Yeah. So I think I still think when you look at all of it, I think that was the biggest fear, even at the height of the Red Scare for the Hollywood moguls. The biggest fear was saving their business.
Yeah. Let's skip ahead to the dissolution of essentially the dissolution of the Warner Brothers. I mean, this, it's kind of a sad ending to their business and personal relationship. But what happened between Harry and Jack when they decided to sell the company that led to them having such a falling out?
Yeah, this is a story that couldn't have been written better for the movies. I mean, yeah, it's like you said, it's a really sad story. And I've in recent, this year, I finally met Greg Orr, Jack's grandson, and we've talked a lot about this too. And this goes back to the 20s. So the Jack and Harry were kind of always at odds with one another. And it's important to point out that Harry and Albert were the very old school brothers, where Sam and Jack were very much young. And actually, in Greg Orr's documentary, Neil Gabler points this perfectly. He says that the Harry and Albert were very old world in their way of living, and Jack and Sam were very new world. And so the thing about Sam, so Sam dies, I don't think we mentioned that. So Sam dies in 27, right before The Jazz Singer comes out. Sam was very much this bridge between his older brothers and Jack. And Jack was always kind of this troublemaker, always kind of, like I said, kind of the clown, which can be useful and not. When Sam dies, there's no longer this bridge between Harry and Jack. And now you have decades worth of competition and resentment and frustration that builds up. And, Harry was, he was married to the same woman. Very few people have bad things to say about him. It doesn't seem like there was no affairs. Whereas with Jack, he was, like you mentioned him as a womanizer. He wasn't really the casting couch guy, but he was also not a great husband and parent. He would be married. He would always also have a girlfriend. That annoyed Harry to no end. Lots of high profile battles over that. So you have all of this stuff brewing for decades. Now they want to retire. And one of the things when the brothers got started, one of the things their dad said that Harry took to heart was that if you do everything together, you will all be fine. Whether it's you're succeeding or failing, if you're together, you will be able to weather the ups and downs no matter what. And Harry took this to heart, and he lived his life this way. Everything for the family, everything to protect the family. Jax didn't really care about that so much. So when it came time to retire and start floating around, let's cash in our chips. There was, back and forth about, we got to do this all together. Finally, everybody gets on board. Jack and Harry and Sam are all gonna sell to
Jack and Harry and Albert.
Semenenko.
Jack and Harry and Albert.
Or Jack and Harry and Albert. Sorry, we're just talking about Sam. Yeah, Sam passes, so Jack, Harry, and Albert are getting ready to sell. But as Greg Orr had pointed out, Jack's grandson, there was talk in the press about, well, even if the Warner Brothers sell their interest, they're going to need somebody to run the studio who knows the studio. So Jack is a possible person to maybe, even if he sells his shares, still run the production part of the studio for a while. So Jack was the production head. Harry was the president of the studio. Albert was running distribution and things like that. So what happened was they agreed to sell. They signed the papers to sell all their shares. What Jack did was take a backdoor deal to buy some of his shares back, and then not only come back in to run the studio, but become president of the studio. So take Harry's job. And this is something that, that day when that was learned, Harry had a heart attack. I mean, he was so broken by this. And his secretary, the interview of his secretary that Cass Warner recorded and put on her website, which is fantastic. Thank you, Cass. Where she tells about being in the office when Harry gets this news and just how heartbreaking it is to see this guy go through this. And again, this is why I mentioned the one for all family thing, that even though, and that's what really broke Harry, is that, that Jack really just did not care of their father's wishes. And Harry had nothing but respect and admiration for his parents and the sacrifice that they did, and for bringing them to the United States. And, and multiple times when the brothers had lost everything, they had, sold all their jewelry or gave their savings to the brothers for the next startup, whether it was for another theater, whether it was for a grocery store, bike shop, any one of their ventures. Harry thought that, going out together, this would be our final ode to our parents' sacrifice. And Jack kind of pissed all over that. And that broke Harry's heart. And Harry's family, even the descendants to this day fully believe that Jack killed Harry, because Harry had this heart attack from which he never fully recovered. He lived in kind of a crippled state for a couple years and then died. And Jack didn't come home for the funeral. And there was a lot of bad feelings around that. And like you said, it's really sad, and it's a really heartbreaking. There's a story of Jack's son who, and again, Jack, basically wrote his son off, and they were estranged, most of their adult life. There's a story I say in the book where Jack Jr. goes to visit Harry, and he's still close with Harry and Albert, and Jack comes bouncing in for some reason, and Harry just goes stone cold, and he's fighting back tears, and he can't even look at him. And it's just this heartbreaking thing to read. that just tells us everything about how Harry felt and how a lot of the family felt about Jack's actions. And that's that whole sale and Jack coming back in and stuff really broke a lot of the family. And that's why I titled that section, End of the Studio, but also End of the Family, because it was something from which the family never recovered.
On that bright note, happy, cheery note, as you know, I always like to ask at the end of these shows if there's anything I should have asked, if there's anything you think folks should know about the book, Warner Brothers, the family, anything. What should folks know?
Oh man, there's so much. There the lead up to 1923 is really fascinating. So to know like where what the brothers, their trials and tribulations leading up to that. I think, we talked a lot about Harry. I think a big part of what I wanted to do with this book was really focus on Harry. He gave a lot of really powerful speeches. He was one of these people that he wore his heart on his sleeve. And I think the best example I can give is that after the Holocaust and after World War II, Harry literally tried to save all of the displaced families himself. He was having meetings with President Truman. He was trying to bring them all to Alaska because there was room. He was going to fund it. He was going to build infrastructure in Alaska to house all these people so we could then slowly bring them down into the United States. Just incredible stuff from him. So that was, that kind of stuff. And then also with Jack, and we talked a lot about how bad Jack is, there was a lot of surprising stuff too. There was a lot of good things about Jack that might surprise some people. Things that he did. He treated his family like shit, and sometimes his actors, but he also kept silent stars on the payroll when they aged out, and he helped a lot of people, surprisingly. So he also there was another side of him that I think will surprise a lot of people.
Yeah. Chris, thanks for being on the show. The name again of the book is The Warner Brothers. Pretty simple. Just search for Chris Yogerst, Yogerst, at Amazon or Barnes & Noble, wherever books are sold. And The Warner Brothers, you'll easily find it. It's well worth reading if you're interested in the early history of Hollywood and the Hollywood moguls and that period in history. So check it out. Thanks again for being on the show.
Thank you for having me.
My name is Sonny Bunch. I am culture editor at The Bulwark, and I will be back next week with another episode. We'll see you guys then.